Let's Talk Small Business, the real talk, no BS podcast for business owners and entrepreneurs who want to grow and actually enjoy the ride. I'm Mitchell Wilson. Let's get into it. Today's guest is Keith Erwood, co-founder of Erwood Group, where he helps businesses build practical business continuity and disaster recovery strategies that actually work when things go to shit. Keith brings more than 20 years of consulting experience, and he's worked with organizations ranging from small family-run firms through to major brands like JetBlue. Now, he's authored continuity plans protecting more than $1 billion in annual revenue and built tools that help leaders understand the real cost of downtime and the real return on resilience. So what I think stands out about Keith is that he does not approach this continuity planning as like a box ticking exercise. He sees it as a strategic business lever, something that protects reputation and also revenue and decision making when the pressure hits. So for small business owners, this conversation is especially relevant because most businesses do not think about resilience until something breaks. So, Keith, let's talk small business.
Yeah, I'm excited and happy to be here on Coach Birds, and thanks, Mitchell, for having me.
Yeah, no worries, man.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, good. Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for having me.
Hey, listen, for business owners that are listening, who hears terms today that are like continuity, resilience, disaster recovery, and thinks it all sounds very corporate, how would you explain what this really means in day-to-day business terms?
Well, thanks for that question, because whenever I throw out those terms, I usually get what I call the deer in the headlights look. So I try to break it down like really simple, where we just talk about business preparedness planning. Right? And like, what is that? And it's basically simple. There's a couple things that we do from a foundational level, like risk assessments and business impact analysis. But then we also get into recovery strategies and the actual plan building of if you run into certain situations or disruptions to your business, the planning ahead of time is what actually helps you pivot and stay in business while serving your customers, keeping your revenue and cash flow flowing, and managing your reputation.
Okay. So, Keith, can you just take me back to your personal early days? Like, how did your journey into this, I guess, deep focus of, business disaster recovery and the rest? Where's this come from and where's your journey taken you?
Sure. So that's an actual interesting story. I kind of like to say my life has come full circle, because when I was a young boy, and like I mentioned to you earlier when we were just talking, like I grew up in New York City, but my grandparents lived in upstate New York in the country. And my favorite thing to do there, we go up there every summer and we go to the county fair. And my first place I would run to is the pavilion where the Civil Defense and Red Cross were, where they had all the pamphlets on man-made and natural disasters and preparedness planning. And that was my first step. I'd grab every piece of paper I could and I'd sit there and bring it back to the house and read for hours on end, days, the whole entire time we were there, and bring it home. Then I found myself, my plan was, if things went really bad in New York City, I had a go bag even from the age of 8. And my plan was to hike all the way back up to my grandparents. Not sure if that would have actually really happened, but that's what I did and planned for. Long story short, though.
Are you what they call one of the preppers? Do you have like a bunker somewhere sort of full of cans of...
You could say that. Not off the deep end where everything has to be very well prepared, but I'm pretty well prepared. And I know you don't know this because I haven't really written about it, but I'm about to relaunch it again, where I had a pretty popular blog way back when, and I stopped writing for it. There's a couple reasons why, but it was a disaster preparedness blog. So if
I love
it's
it.
still
and I'll tell you what.
there.
Well, I'm kind of thinking, that seems kind of odd for a young guy to do that. But I think back to my own son at the moment, and he loves there are a book series called I Survived. Lots of different sort of areas, and he loves them as well. So there you go.
Yeah. My son loves those too, and I get a kick out of it. And I kind of open them up and read them also, since he brings them home. But yeah, kind of getting back to the story though, is it kind of had a little bumps in the road. I became New York State and then New York City EMT, started working for Health and Hospitals Corporation in New York City EMS. And my goal with that was to kind of become a doctor. That was the goal. I was working towards becoming a physician's assistant, and then I had everything lined up to become a doctor. But the city was in like financial trouble. So I started working there in 1993. And then in 1996, with the city being in financial trouble, they took us out from underneath Health and Hospitals Corporation and merged us with the fire department. Nothing against the fire department or being a firefighter, but basically the healthcare side of the stuff disappeared. And that was kind of like my back door into becoming a doctor, where I didn't have to pay to go to medical school. My plan was when I essentially I was getting paid to go to school from Health and Hospitals, but it disappeared. Long story short there, I kind of had a third passion, which was computers. So I sold myself, if I have to go to school and pay for it myself, I was going to go back to school for IT computer networking. And that's what I did. Along the way, and even before that, I was involved with computers and was working on the side, like kind of the side job of doing computer stuff. And I started doing data recovery, mostly for friends and other businesses. And then I kind of started doing it even more on the side, where other consultants and small computer shops I knew, if they were too busy and needed someone to do that, they would call me. So I would go in and recover data for people. And the irony is, back then that was really easy. Like today, it's a bit harder to do, the way the systems are designed and everything. Mm-hmm. But I mean, you can still do it. But I was really good at it. And then eventually I ran into a business owner that knew I worked in EMS. And for some reason, he kind of put two and two together and like, hey, like you're into like emergency management and computers. Help me put a plan together so this never happens again. So that was like my first foray into like a bigger picture of doing that. Then I had an opportunity for another job outside of the fire department, where somebody approached me, and it was a big company. After 9/11, they were redoing the fire department operations center, like the whole computer operations center, war room and stuff up there. And because of the crossover, they wanted me to be their consultant in the fire department for these new systems. But I kind of ran into a roadblock with that. Because I already worked for the fire department, the only hurdle that I had to clear was the New York City legal department, from an ethical standpoint, had to give their blessing to it. And basically I was told, in order to do anything like that or come back and consult for the fire department, you have to quit the fire department, not have contact with anybody for a year, and then come back. So there was a bunch of things that happened around the same time. And I kind of just said, you know what, I'm kind of done with the fire department. So I left and kind of started my foray into the computer networking and computer IT world.
Now, I'm just going to pause you there because I am just a little bit curious and I don't want to get sidetracked too much. But of course, you were in the fire department. I happened to be in New York under the World Trade Center in 2001 myself.
Okay.
Anything that you care to share about those moments, being in that kind of arena during that time?
Yeah, well, very chaotic and interesting. And that had a major impact also on why I do what I do today, right? I didn't plan on talking about that, but here we are. So
look, it's only if you want to talk about it.
No, it's fine. There's a lot there. So here's an interesting part. I don't usually share this with a lot of people, but basically, and I'm about to share it with the world. A few days before 9/11, I had worked in Brooklyn, New York for most of my career, like 9.5 years or something along those lines. And I had the same partner for 9.5 years. He passed away a few years ago with 9/11 related cancer after that. But I had made a transfer to Staten Island, where I lived and grew up, to go to the night shift so that I could focus on my computer consulting business during the day. And my first day on Staten Island working EMS on Staten Island was the day before 9/11 happened.
Yeah.
And I was working the afternoon shift, like from 4 in the afternoon to 12, 4 to 12s. And the very next day was when 9/11 happened. So, and there's some interesting stories there. So I had previously worked overtime. So that's a long story. I won't get into that. But basically, I was asleep when those attacks happened. And this part is actually pivotal because I was actually going to get to this next. But my fiance, she lived in California. And she was up and she knew, and she called me on the phone. And she's like, you have to get up. I'm like, well, why? What happened? Right. So she woke me. It's still pretty early in the morning, but it's just after the second plane had hit and then all the major news broke out. So she called me and then she's like, no, you got to get up. There was like a terrorist attack. And I was like, well, what happened? Like a car bomb went off in like Manhattan. Like, so that's where my thinking was. And that's where most of the training was. And there's some ironies there to me too, because I was pretty vocal with some of the people I worked with that I had said, like, you know, the World Trade Center was pretty big. And like you said that you were there, like you could see it from other parts of New York, like even from far away. It stood out, like how tall it was. And knowing what I knew, like from the first attack, whatever, I knew that they were going to try again. And I even told people, like, you know, they're not going to be there forever. Like they're going to do it and they're going to take them out. I never thought that it was going to be an attack with like 2 planes though. Like that never crossed my mind, but I was pretty vocal in it. But anyway, getting back in, like my wife told me, so I was thinking car bomb. She's like, no, she wouldn't even tell me what it was. She's just like, you got to turn on the TV. So I turned on the TV and this is probably within 15 minutes of the second plane hitting, give or take. Cause like, I'm not really, I had just woken up. I wasn't really familiar with or remember like exactly the time frame that things happen. But I just remember turning on the TV, sitting there watching it on TV, and I wasn't necessarily thinking, okay, I have to go to work at that moment, right? Like I was just sitting there kind of in shock, just like the rest of the world watching it on TV. And then I watched the first tower fall down and then the next one fall down. And I'm like, I got to go into work. So at the time, my mindset was, all right, I got to go in, and I wasn't sure what was going to happen. And at the time, my parents were at my sister's house. My sister, like everybody else, was at work, but my parents watched my young nephews. And my nephews, 2 of them at the time, my sister has 7 kids today, but at the time, just 2. And I went there because I was thinking, I got to go to work. I don't know what's going to happen. And it might be the last time I ever see like those members of my family ever again. That was the thought that was in my mind. So I went, saw my mother, my nephew, gave him a kiss goodbye, went into work. And then I got to work and there was a lot of things happening. They were actually getting a New York City transit bus to bring us and a bunch of people into Manhattan. And that was the plan. But then about an hour into that, they put that on hold. And then they said, we're just going to continue the operations we have in Manhattan with the people who were there. But my experience was within the first like 72 hours was very different because this is also my second day on Staten Island, right? So the supervisors that were there at the time, they didn't know me and they weren't familiar with me. They thought it was like my second day on the job. So they were kind of hesitant, like sending me in. They didn't know. So I ended up working a little bit early, went on an ambulance early. The thing that I remember too about that is New York City EMS was one of the first city agencies to kind of pick up the pieces and kind of respond as normal. Like there was still a lot of chaos, but, hopped on the ambulance and did regular 911 calls. Thankfully, there were a lot less of them that day because of everything else going on. But the ones that I did respond to were mostly people kind of freaking out about what was going on, which is understandable. So it was like a lot of like mental health type calls coming in where people were like freaking out and distraught over what was happening, and people were pretty fearful of like what's going to happen next. But to kind of get into it, and this is more like my experience for like the first few months and even the whole entire recovery effort time, was after that night my shift ended, and then I went home. I came back the next day for my regular shift because they were like, we don't need more people coming in at this point. So I worked my second shift, and then I worked an overtime shift. My first shift when I went in the second day, so this is the 12th, I came in and worked my regular shift for 8 hours. But then I picked up another second shift on overtime, and that's where they started, and I don't know what you know about it, but that's where they started bringing things over to the Staten Island landfill. So I was one of the first people in units, as far as EMS goes, like up on the landfill where they were doing it. And my first recollection out of that was, I don't know if you've seen the show, but the X-Files. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it was like a scene out of that, because that first initial night it was people dressed up in Tyvek suits, like the white Tyvek suits, gloves and boots and respirators. And so you couldn't really see, you just saw people. And then what they did was they had special generators with spotlights. Mm-hmm. So they just had a bunch of spotlights all over the top of the landfill, and then people walking around in the Tyvek suits. And they were on a mission. They were looking for both evidence and body parts at that point. And it was very surreal, like, to me. And that was like my first experience of it. And then from there, almost every night after that, or every day after that, most of my shifts were at the landfill for about 6 months. But after I worked the double shift overtime, I got back to the station, and people were heading into Manhattan, or Ground Zero. It was already called Ground Zero at that point. And then, so this is the morning of the 13th. It's about 5:30 in the morning, still pitch black out. I hop on a city bus with about 4 or 5 other EMS people, and we take the city bus down to the Staten Island ferry. We get on the ferry with a bunch of other EMS workers from our station, a bunch of firemen and firefighters and police officers heading over on the ferry down into Manhattan. And then I remember as we're going across the harbor, and we see the lights, the missing towers, the lights, the smoke rising up from the scene, a bunch of cranes, and it was just very surreal. And then we get to Manhattan. So we get to Manhattan, and we had to walk the rest of the way. And as we get out of the ferry terminal on the Manhattan side, there's papers everywhere, like just papers blowing in the wind everywhere. And as we get closer and closer to Ground Zero, the amount of dust starts picking up. Like first there was nothing. Then there was like a dusting on the ground of dust. And I still remember it was like a grayish beige color, like mixed, mostly gray. And it got to the point where as we get there, it gets from nothing to a little bit of a dusting to about maybe 2 or 3 inches of dust all the way up. And we had to walk around. One of the first people we met construction workers, and they were moving at that time cars and piling crushed cars up on one on top of the other. And then from there we meet some firefighters, and the guy, he's crying because he lost a lot of people he knew. And then we walked through like a makeshift morgue, and they were just which is actually at that time it kind of still is, with like the World Financial Center buildings. And we walked through there, and it was like a makeshift morgue. There were just bodies and people everywhere at that time. And then as we get out the other side, it's starting to get light outside, and we come out the building. And I remember we came out the building on the other side and look up, and that's where we could see, I don't know if you've noted like in pictures, but that's where with the World Financial Center, they had that glass dome and those buildings, and you could see part of the metal of the building sticking out like precariously, like right above us, like that, like that's remember like what I remember seeing. And basically you got there, we went to like the staging area, and basically I was there. They had so many people there that unfortunately for us, like a lot of us, like on the EMS side, we were just kind of sitting around. So I was there for like another good 8 hours. So I'm going on to like 30 something plus hours straight working. And then I did some stuff, drove some firefighters around on some vehicles, but I didn't really feel like I was doing anything useful, and I was tired. So I eventually had to walk back down. It was me and another EMS guy. And then basically, yeah, we had to take the ferry back across. And then by the time I got home after that, it was probably around like 4 o'clock in the afternoon on that next day.
Hey Keith, I appreciate you sharing that. And I mean, you know, it's just burned in people's minds, I guess, the stories that you're mentioning. So I'm sure that. Do you believe that changed the thinking of how you sort of think about life, and I guess bringing it back to business, that anything can happen?
Yeah, well, it definitely changed my life. And so, like I said too, like I was up at the landfill almost every day after that. And the interesting part about why we were there, it was different than Ground Zero, where like a lot of stuff at Ground Zero where people participating in the recovery efforts, for where we were at the landfill, like our sole purpose for being there was like for being EMS response for the people there. And the interesting thing about that, as far as I know, more people got seriously injured up at the landfill than, and I'm not saying like people got injured afterwards, but there was something interesting that happened, and that it sticks in my mind. I'll never forget it. Was, up at the landfill, and like up there, you're in the middle of nowhere. You're up on top of a huge garbage mountain, and then the wind's blowing. And one of the things that happened to somebody else was they got dust in their mouth and they breathed it in, and they went into anaphylactic shock. So I happened to be there. We saved this guy's life, but that was the primary reason why we were there, because to prevent people from getting sick or injured from the stuff that was there. And while there wasn't people getting hurt all the time, so there was a lot of time sitting up there in the ambulance, time to kill, and had a lot of thinking going on. And one of the things I experienced was the people who owned restaurants were providing, especially in the beginning, were providing food, and everything was chaotic. And I also knew that in Manhattan, there were other restaurants that were providing food for the recovery workers and the firefighters and everybody. And I kind of learned a couple stories. Like there were businesses that went out of business. And then some of these people who were providing food for people, their restaurant went out of business. And I'm sure they did stuff later on, but that's one of the key things, like that and this IT stuff I was doing beforehand actually became one of the key reasons why I do what I do today. And it's because the small and medium-sized businesses that are impacted from, even if it's a small scale event, but particularly large scale events, causes them to go out of business pretty quickly compared to big business. And not that big business doesn't suffer, but that's one of the key reasons why I focused on small and medium-sized businesses.
Okay, so let me get this out of the way. A lot of small, medium-sized business owners are focused on sales and cash flow and staffing. And I know that the resilience, the stuff that you work on gets pushed down the list until it's too late. It happens to a lot. Let's be realistic. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that we just don't think about that from day one?
Well, there is a lot there with that. So, and I even talk about, so like, unfortunately, especially with small and medium-sized businesses, is they don't necessarily call me beforehand. Like the common thinking is, oh, I'll call you after something
Yeah,
happens. And
yeah.
that is what usually happens. The problem with that is like, yes, I'll help you, but what I can do is very limited because things weren't put into place beforehand. Like usually it's advising them about different aspects or dealing with insurance at that point. But beforehand, if you put plans in place, there's a lot of different things that you can do. One of the key things though is, I would say, especially for small businesses, like you can start for free. Like all it takes is thinking. Like if something happens, how am I going to do something different? Like if I rely on a process, what can I do different if it's impacted, right? And so like one key thing today that I'll tell small and mid-sized businesses, like almost everything today is computerized. And like if you have like, let's just take like, if I talk about like a small flower shop or cake shop, right? And they do weddings. Well, one of the key things that they can do is for this week coming up, print out your contact list, print out your customers that are like coming in this week. Just that one thing alone, like if there's some type of fire or calamity at their business, being able to reach out to the customers or knowing which customers are coming in that week makes a huge difference. Because I can't tell you how many businesses just like that you'll hear from. We lost everything and I don't even know who my customers are to call this week. And that's a very common thing. But the other side of that too, and it's kind of a double-edged sword, is they're worried about revenue and cash flow, which it's extremely important. And one of the first things that happens when you have a disruption is you tend to have reductions in revenue and cash flow. So kind of preparing or planning for that is a big thing. And then you can also think about ways to kind of increase revenue or cash flow. Most businesses, as I'm sure you know, as like a coach, right, is that businesses aren't really necessarily charging enough. You know, there are certain limitations where, you know, you might not be able to raise prices, but if you could say, raise your price by even 5, 10, 15, 20%, like depending upon what you are. And it is a little bit harder if you're in like a retail market, but in other areas, like you can raise it a little bit and then kind of build a cushion, right, of your cash flow. The one disadvantage that small businesses have that big businesses don't have is even if a big business gets hit with a loss in revenue stream, is they usually have other methods of ways of making that up, or they can withstand time based upon cash, or they can refinance loans. And there's many different things that they can do. There's certain strategies that small and mid-sized businesses can do along the same lines. But the biggest challenge for small businesses is that disruption to cash flow, because that monthly cash flow coming in is usually how they navigate where they buy more inventory, they pay employees, different things. As soon as that gets shut off, they have problems. So
Now, you talk about the cost of downtime.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you share an example of how a business maybe changed its priorities once it did understand that cost of disruption to, I guess, off before the fact?
Yeah. So there's a couple things with that, and understanding how, like, right, if your business is disrupted, and there's different types of disruption, right? It's like, okay, if you have some type of software and your software vendor, and there's some type of outage and it might last an hour or a day or a couple days, whatever. There's different planning that you can do around that. But one of the strategies that I like to use, and I was one of the first to use it many, like going back 20 years ago, but everybody does it now. But looking at downtime and what your downtime costs are going to be. But I don't just look at it from a standpoint of, if you have a disruption, you lose revenue. There's that cost, but there's also the cost of how much are you paying your employees while you're not earning revenue? There's the lost productivity. There's the cost of how, like the backlog, and then how much it costs you to catch up. So those are some key areas that I look at that a lot of people don't even think about. And then there's other things like regulatory. So for businesses that don't have, and a lot of small businesses don't have this, some medium-sized businesses or certain industries do, where like if you're in the finance sector, like even if you're a small business CPA, you have certain regulations that you have to follow.
Yep.
So there's some challenges there. But once you know your cost of downtime, there's a lot of things that you can figure out. And the key to that is knowing where it's not just how much you lose per hour, but it's where like you become completely basically in trouble, right? If you have your maximum allowable downtime, and then let's say for most businesses, and from a small business standpoint, a small business, if they are losing revenue or cash flow for even like a week, that could put them out of business. And where you need to know is two things from that. Where does revenue or cash flow loss severely impact your business? And then two, what can you do to recover your services or your product line and get back into business from like a minimum viable standpoint, right? Like today, a lot of people, right? You'll hear, especially in marketing or some business coaches talk about, well, first create your minimum viable product, right?
Mhm.
So most businesses are operating at like peak levels, right? Your peak performance is you have everything in place that you need to perform to deliver your customers your services and goods. But when you're completely disrupted, what you want to do is kind of fall back to that minimum viable product level. Is like, what's the bare minimum that we can deliver to our clients and keep them happy and keep our cash flow and revenue flowing while we put other things back in place as we're recovering. So that's a key distinction.
And part of this planning and process, tell me where insurance comes into play, like business disruption insurance and all that kind of stuff.
Right. So there's a lot of different areas with insurance, and insurance is very interesting, I'll say, because we need insurance, right? Or we should have insurance. And there's different types of insurance. So you have like the property and casualty insurance, right? That usually protects, let's say if you have a facility or a building, it usually protects that. Then you also have, and that also protects like key equipment and assets too. Then you'll have different other types of insurance, like you have income loss insurance, and that's usually for the business owners. So that's another key insurance to have to prevent disruptions to your revenue or your cash flow. That's important. But the other side to insurance is there's a lot of interesting aspects with insurance where I'll say it like this, like just for argument's sake, let's say you have $100,000 in insurance coverage, just to make this simple. What happens is a disruption happens, and the first thought is, well, I have insurance. It's going to cover it. Oh, I have $100,000. They'll cover that. But that's not the reality of how that works. So as a case in point, like let's just say, to keep it simple, part of your business is damaged, but you can't use your whole office. Like let's say there was a small fire, between the smoke and the water damage, your whole office is knocked out. What they'll do is they'll come in and they'll give you like partial insurance, like to rebuild that. They might also cover the fees involved for you to relocate. And I kept the number small for a reason. Like most people have vastly larger amounts of insurance, but there's something about insurance that a lot of people don't understand. And that is there's penalties involved, there's exclusions involved, and there's also, one of the interesting things is there's something called co-insurance that most people aren't even aware of unless they either come from that industry or they've been impacted before or they actually studied their policy really well. And that comes in where, let's say if you have your facility and you purchased it, it was in dollars. You have your $100,000 insurance coverage, but you got that insurance coverage, let's say 5 years ago, and you kept it the same policy. But over time, two things happen. One is your property increases in value. And then two, usually local laws or ordinances, and I'm not sure how things are in New Zealand, but I could also tell you, especially being in California, you have two things that happen. Local ordinances change with the building codes and the property value goes up, but you kept your insurance level the same. So what happens is the cost to rebuild your building goes up, usually substantially, because the value went up. Then there's new local ordinances. So in California, like let's say, okay, they put in stronger earthquake protection, which I know in New Zealand they have.
Yeah,
so
all about that.
The cost of that goes up. And what happens is you kept your insurance level at the same instead of increasing your policy. So what the insurance company turns around and does, like let's say, to keep it really simple, let's say it's $100,000, $100,000 policy, and the value is 100, or what was $100,000 building, but now it's 100. We'll say it's 150. So let's say the insurance company looks at that and says, well, you're $50,000 short on the policy, so they consider you picking that $50,000 up. So now instead of $100,000, they're knocking $50,000 off. So now you have $50,000. Then they include any deductible that you have, which could be anywhere from a couple hundred to several $1,000s, depending upon your policy. So it's very likely that if you didn't increase your insurance amount, that you're not going to actually have enough that you're going to have to pay out of pocket to restore your building or recover your assets. Now, there's definitely things like you could do, but that's how the initial thing is going to go. So a lot of people just assume I have 100. Yeah.
I was going to say, from what I understand, most people, businesses, whatever, underinsured than overinsured.
Yes.
I don't know what the percentage is. I'm pretty confident about that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So
there's definitely things with that.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm, again, just talked to a lot of people, and there are a lot of people, and you talked about, backing up your flower orders before, but I see a lot of people that may have their one computer, nothing's backed up, and when that craps out, they're buggered. So let's talk about just briefly computer backup. What do you suggest there?
Yeah. So this is a really interesting topic, and there's two things with it. The good news is, because small and medium-sized businesses, most of them aren't, or they don't fall under big regulatory bodies where you have to have certain things in place. It actually makes what they should be doing is backing up their data, and it should make it very easy to do. It's just that people choose not to do it, or people have the mindset like, that's never going to happen to me. But backing up your computer could be as simple as having an extra hard drive, backing it up to that. I don't know how things are where you're at, but I know, right, I could walk into a big box store or one of these like club membership, like a Costco or a Sam's Club, and I can very easily pick up a 2 terabyte hard drive, and I could back up a lot of my data. The thing with that is you definitely need multiple copies if that's what your situation is going to be. And then I would implore you that if you work from home, like I do, I work from home, that you also keep backup copies off site outside your home. Or if you have a place of business, store copies at your site, but also take a copy home with you. And I would do that at the very least. But also, today's day and age, there's no reason why, with all the options that are out there, that you can't back up your data. Everything from, Google Drive to AWS, like Amazon Web Services. Even as a small business, it's actually really easy and cost effective for you to back up your data. There's no reason not to do it. But yet we still see businesses all the time impacted because they didn't back up their data. Then backing up your data and restoring it are two different things, but that's another add-on to that.
Keith, thank you so much for joining us. And look, if you're listening today, take this as a sign that right now you need to, 1, make sure you've got some backups on your computer. 2, look at your insurance and what you got. And then start thinking about resilience. What happens if? So it's been a great reminder today. Before we wrap up here, where can listeners find you, connect with you, or learn more about the work that you're doing through Erwood Group?
All right, great. Well, so the easiest place to find me, right, or connect with me would be on LinkedIn. So Keith Erwood, KeithErwood. As far as I know, I'm the only one in the world. I had another, but he passed away. There's a few Erwoods out there. I think there's one in New Zealand. I know there's a couple in Australia, but I think we're all related. But there's not many of us. The other way is I do have and I don't know if you're okay with this. If not, you can cut it out. But I have a free members, like the endurance community, where you could go to members.erwoodgroup.com, which is my company, but it's a membership site where I give free resources, tools, some live learnings, and just talk about crisis management, business continuity, and IT disaster recovery. That's pretty much it all the time.
Brilliant. I love it. So if you're listening to this episode and you are thinking differently about your business, whether it's sales, systems, or strategy, that is the point. So if you do want help identifying your biggest bottleneck, mapping out your next smart move, you can always book a free breakthrough session with myself and the Coach Birds team. Thanks again, Keith. We haven't just talked business. We've heard your side of the story, or from your point of view, a very momentous time in history, being 9/11. So I really appreciate you for sharing that, along with all the business insights. So to everyone else listening, keep building the kind of business you can grow, adapt, and stay strong when it counts. Thanks very much. Let's talk small business. I appreciate you tuning in. If you got value, hit subscribe, like, or drop a comment. It spreads the word and might just help another legend get their breakthrough.